As China and the United States enjoyed 4 decades of engagement, their relations on economy, trade, and technology have gone through a roller coaster. When Peter Navarro, a senior China advisor to U.S. President Donald Trump, quoted a fake expert to support his claims about Beijing's alleged threat to the American economy, how will scholars in China and the U.S. enhance exchanges to narrow differences and to manage the extensive damage? Are we facing a potential threat of a decoupling or a return to the Cold War? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined by Chen Dongxiao, President of the Shanghai Institute of International Studies, in the first half of our program. In the second part, we shall be joined by Michael D. Swain, a Senior Fellow of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui.
Peter Navarro's book, Debt by China, was a sequel to his bestseller, The Coming China Wars. But the South China Morning Post on Friday revealed that the PhD economist used a fake source within its pages to support his false claims about China. The book's publisher, Prentice Hall, confirmed that the source, an alleged Harvard-educated economist called Ron Vara, doesn't actually exist, and all reprints would include an alert about the fake source. In the book, Navarro accuses China of currency manipulation, deliberately harming Americans with dangerous consumer goods, and a laundry list of other accusations. Numerous Chinese experts quoted in a 2017 foreign policy profile spoke of Navarro as someone who made no effort to interact with specialists in the field, with one describing his work as full of hyperbole, inaccuracies, and a cartoonish caricature of China. As the most vocal proponent of the trade war, Navarro is under increasing pressure because of the standoff that is now cutting into global economic growth and testing the patience of American corporations and farmers.
Welcome to Dialogue, Professor Chen. 20 years ago exactly, when I first started hosting this program, Dialogue, I asked a question for Professor Yan Xuetong from Tsinghua University. The question was, what do you think of the alleged self-fulfilling prophecy? Namely, if you take China as an enemy, China would be your enemy. If you take China as a friend, China would be your friend. Today, looking back, do you think in the case of Peter Navarro, he used the fictional name as an expert of Chinese studies, all of the allegations and discourses about that China could somehow be fictional. It's been way exaggerated.
The political situation in general in the United States has changed quite quickly, particularly in terms of its perception about China. We have seen the mood in Washington extremely negative these days about China. There's a growing consensus that those almost 30 plus, or some people said 40 plus years of consensus, the so-called engagement policy towards China, has miserably failed, as some people alleged, particularly by our American colleagues. While at the same time, we have seen a fundamental shift in their policy, as well as in their kind of out of those political correctness, that they try to be more tough vis-a-vis Beijing. So this is the new consensus. And it is in that regard, I think that your question refers to whether the fabrication, those scandal by Mr. Navarro will help reduce or change the policymakers' perception about China. I'm quite doubtful about that.
You're doubtful?
I'm quite doubtful about that because it's if Mr. Navarro were still a professor or an expert working in the think tank, I'm quite for certain that his academic integrity, his credibility
will be compromised.
Not compromised, but I think gravely damaged. And I think even would say that that will seal his career development as a professor. But however, this is not a kind of a academic debate about whether his argument is correct or groundless. but it's a political issue. And those people in Washington nowadays, it is them who try to learn something which is, they believe that favorable to their music, it's kind of a music to their ears. So it is those guys, hawkish people in the White House, in the Congress, in the State Department or DOD, who try to learn something, who try to get those stories from Navarro. It is not because of Navarro, but because of those people who believe that their previous policy towards China will go no way, so they try to change. So that's the totally different atmosphere and the circumstances.
Having said this, Professor Chen, what do you think of the leadership of Donald Trump, which has caused a serious division, political and social, between the Americans since he took office 3 years ago? He only focuses on, and single-mindedly focuses on, the arts of deal, the best deal for Americans, putting America first. And therefore, China would love to deal with someone who's realistic, not out of ideology to bash China like what happened during the Cold War between the two arch rivals, the Soviet Union and the United States. What do you think of this kind of calculations, be they on the Chinese side or for other international observers?
President Trump is a very unique politician. I think that his DNA is a real estate developer in New York City. Well, whether it is a real estate developer in Moscow, or in New York, in Madrid, or even in Shanghai, I think that they are similar. They are similar. They try to maximize their benefits. They try to grasp any kind of opportunity to get a better deal. Of course, I think President Trump has not only have those a traditional DNA as a businessman, but he also, based upon his long time of experience.
Whatever his unique personality or a business background in New York, there is always the issue of a common sense for whoever would run a real estate company. That is a win-win. But this man is very different. Is that because of the hostile team that he runs? Peter Navarro, Stephen Bannon, Lighthizer, these guys are very tough. So he's coming under the influence of his advisors, despite the departure of John Bolton, one reason or another. What do you think of the issue of common sense? You have to be win-win, otherwise, there won't be any future.
Yeah, I think that President Trump is particularly obsessed with the so-called trade balance. And he believed that any side who have enjoyed the surplus at the expense of the United States has actually, as he said, that has made U.S. totally lost. So this is one of his a very deep-rooted mindset. It's difficult to change. You mentioned the divided America. Well, in the past more than 30 decades, following the end of a Cold War, we have seen the so-called gilded globalization, economic globalization, with those people in the Wall Street and those people in Silicon Valley. When they combined the so-called strength together, they reaped the biggest benefit of those globalization. But at the same time, what about those people, relatively, I would say, disadvantageous people, quote and end quote, in the United States, who have not adapt themselves to these new circumstances. I think for the first decades, they believed in what Washington told them, that as long as the economic growth around the world and the U.S. business people reap the biggest benefit, the biggest proportional benefit, then it will have a spillover effects on them. through those retraining, reprogram to have them, upgraded their capability to deal with those new jobs, but failed. So that's the problem. And those people who are now the staunch supporter of President Trump, and President Trump knows how to deal with them.
What is the most dangerous flashpoint in our relationship, the most consequential relationship? Taiwan, South China Sea, encouraged by the unprecedented political support from Washington. Madam Tsai Ing-wen, leader of Taiwan, made it very clear that she would not accept the One China principle. What do you think of the future of the cross-strait relations?
I think that for a quite long period of time, Washington is trying to keep a kind of so-called balanced hand or even hand. They always try to prevent any side across the strait from take what they call a unilateral revisionist behavior. So this is the reason we have seen that during the George W. Bush's period of time, Washington was very furious about DPP, Chen Shui-bian's pro-independence and unilateral behavior. But now I think that geostrategic circumstances have somewhat changed. Partially because Washington believes that it is mainly China to try to change the status quo, number one. Number two, they believe that Taiwan is a kind of a model of so-called democracy. And now there's a growing or emerging narrative which try to frame the U.S.-China relationship in general as a kind of a dichotomy between the liberal vis-a-vis illiberal. So they believe that in that regard, the Taiwan as a democracy has increased its value. And last but not least, I think that what makes the situation much more risky or dangerous is those recessionist movements, those independent forces in Taiwan. They try to provoke Beijing. They try to provoke Beijing by appeal to Washington to say that they still have a strategic value to play an important role in Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy. So combine those factors together, we have seen that the cross-strait relationship will become a little bit more uncertain.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chen, thanks a lot. Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you.
Look, the current focus of China debates in the United States seem to be why Peter Navarro, a major advisor or a China watcher in the White House to President Donald Trump, has created a fake expert. Then the ultimate truth will be about whether what he's been talking about concerning the image of China and its implications for the United States national security will be fact or fiction. So this has caused a lot of debates. First of all, let me have your initial judgment on the impact of this fake expert.
Well, I think it's hard to say what impact. I don't think it's a huge impact. I think it reflects really that Peter Navarro is somebody who I think many people outside of the U.S. government have not really taken very seriously as an expert on the Chinese economy and on U.S.-China
President Trump
relations.
takes him very seriously.
Yeah, I know he does.
And that matters a lot.
That ultimately, right, will be the key decision maker. If President Trump doesn't like what he's done, then his star will diminish. But at this time, I haven't seen any real evidence of that. Navarro has played this issue as if it was kind of a joke, and he was just sort of having fun with this name, which was really using the letters of his name. and then use this figure as a kind of a symbol to express certain views. But I think you're right. There are a lot of people who are concerned about the fact that he has fictionalized basically a figure to provide for certain types of sources in some of his arguments. And so it makes people wonder exactly how he thinks about China and the economy and the international economy. It just makes one wonder, is he really somebody who is serious about the facts, or is he more somebody who kind of plays with the facts in a kind of whimsical way or a kind of a joking way, which for somebody in his position should not be the case.
And therefore, do you believe that most of the policymakers in the DC, perhaps since the normalization of the bilateral relationship 40 years ago during the Carter administration, have fallen victim to this, what we call self-fulfilling prophecy about the China threat, quote unquote. And therefore, this is more about fiction than facts, because most of the Chinese feel that we have been misunderstood. And I'm the author of a book entitled, Who is Misunderstanding China?
Well, I wouldn't actually go that far. I mean, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on what one person, Peter Navarro, has done and take that as simply a reflection of the overall American misperception of China. I think that Navarro represents a particular extreme point of view within certain circles in the U.S. government and outside the government, in Washington in particular. But I don't think he's the mainstream across the policy sector. If you include people both in and out of government who have policy experience, I think there are many people who look at the U.S.-China relationship today in the U.S., in Washington, and they certainly see that there are many issues where the two sides differ very significantly, and that there is a need for both sides to have a frank dialogue about what their differences are, and that some of these, in terms of the American view of China, are justified. I mean, there are serious concerns about Chinese economic behavior, about area issues to do with security and China's security intentions and motivations in Asia and beyond, that I think all should be examined and discussed more frankly.
Let's look at the role that Peter Navarro plays in the trade negotiations with China. He's a major advisor to President Trump, and yet he's the author of Death by China. Are you hopeful that there will be an end game in a constructive way?
Well, of course I'm hopeful. We should all have hopeful expectations about being able to break this logjam in the U.S.-China trade negotiations. I mean, I've long felt that I thought that although many of the concerns that the United States has about Chinese economic behavior are justified and are problematic, the way in which the administration is going about dealing with them, I think, is very counterproductive. And I think that Peter Navarro represents a point of view that justifies that, what I call a sort of sledgehammer approach to dealing with the trade issues between the U.S. and China. And it, to some degree, has a connection to the view that China's economic policy is in some ways designed to undermine the global economy, and with it to undermine the West and the United States. And that's just a ridiculous notion in my view. It's just one of these extreme generalizations that
but
you
conspiracy
find being
theories are always very popular. Why do you think human beings are often so weak when it comes to threats to their own security? Why do we always live on fears? Now, why do you think such a prophecy would always thrive on fears? The United States is the most powerful military, economic giant, you name it. It's the most attractive destination for immigrants. But why do you think they take China as such a
areas, economic, you name it. You're exerting a much greater influence. And America's role has always been one of what it regards as leadership of the global system in many ways, and a representative of a certain set of values. So China, because it's not a liberal democracy, and because it's getting very large and very influential, of course that raises concerns in the minds of many people. Now the problem is, as you say, some people take that and those uncertainties that this situation produces and these concerns, and they attach it to certain fears. They attach it to certain insecurities that operate domestically in a country, in the United States in this case, but I think they also exist in China. And in that kind of environment where you have social uncertainty, you have some social anxieties about the role of the U.S., about how productive and how much development the United States is going to experience, you then tend to look at different countries or different other sources as the origin of the problem. And you tend to then reflect your fears on other countries. And I think this is not in any way unique to the United States. I think other countries do this as well. I think to some degree, as I just said, China does this. China has gone through a very, very tumultuous period of ups and downs, and it's gone through a very wrenching change through reform and opening that has changed Chinese society in very fundamental ways. And that's produced a lot of good, but it's also produced a lot of instability, a lot of uncertainty. And in that climate, given China's background, given its experience in dealing with foreign imperial powers, imperialist powers in the 19th and early 20th century, there's a tendency in China as well to say our problems are being used, created, or manipulated by the West, by the United States, when in many cases that's not the case.
The presidency of Donald Trump rose on the platform of populism and protectionism, which have reinforced the American traditional way of thinking, looking at things in black and white terms, in a zero-sum way. That's very harmful in the observation of a majority of U.S. watchers to your world leadership. Look at the American media. They criticize more the presidency of Donald Trump than China. I mean, this is just very impressive. And that gave rise to, I was told, a national debate in the United States as to whether the soft power of American liberal democracy will still fuel the role of an example. I mean, this has given rise to a very serious scrutiny about the role that the United States played since the end of the Second World War, and particularly since the end of the Cold War.
You're right. President Trump came to power in the United States on a wave of anxiety and concern that reflected both, in some ways, economic concerns, in some ways, racial, demographic concerns within the United States about how the United States is changing. And it appealed to a lot of people who were very fearful and concerned, and also to, in the case of China, to people who feel that China is not playing fair in the economy, in the global economy, and that China's entrance into the World Trade Organization had a very negative effect on many American workers. So there's a lot of fears and concerns that he has played to. And in the process of his notion about making America great again, he has ignored the history and the legacy of the United States in being a real leader in the international system, of being able to fashion and lead multilateral initiatives in different ways, working with other countries as effectively as possible, as cooperative as possible. He's tended to shun that, and he's tended to, some ways, produce tensions with allies, American allies. So yes, I think the United States has, in many ways, contributed to a weakening of what you would call the global order or global governance. But at the same time, you do have behind all of this a legitimate issue of concern about where the global order goes from here. What is American leadership when you have another country like China, which is very large, a continental power with a very big and growing economy, that is not a democracy? And that raises immediate concerns about what is the underlying set of norms and values that should influence the global system.
Let's look at your article, The Deepening U.S.-China Crisis, Origins and Solutions. Earlier this year, you said that the U.S. administration shift toward viewing China in a more hostile, zero-sum terms would fundamentally and negatively alter the long-term trajectory of U.S.-China relations. Tell us your arguments, basically.
Well, my argument is that the Trump administration, in its effort to deal with some of the problems that have emerged in the U.S.-China relationship and to play to the fears and anxieties of Americans, as I mentioned before, has adopted this very extreme interpretation of China, of China's motives, and of the U.S.-China relationship. The argument is that past American policy has failed because it hasn't developed China into some kind of more liberal and open society, and so it faults past policymakers as being too naive about China, and then it instead replaces that with this very extremist notion that China is this wholesale revisionist power that is an existential threat to the United States, that is determined to overthrow the current global order and establish this very predatory economic system. I mean, it's a cartoon, as I say. It's not accurate. Within it, there are some justifiable concerns about Chinese economic behavior, about Chinese security behavior, yes. And I think those need to be addressed. But the problem is when you replace the past policies with this new extreme zero-sum policy, then those arguments that say we need a nuanced approach, we need something that really does try to strengthen the basis of cooperation as we deal more effectively with our differences, that gets shunned to the side because it's too complex. It's too nuanced of an argument. And so people would say, no. The most important thing to keep in mind is China is a threat. And China, we have to push back. But let me just say, I think that the U.S. administration actually has more recently reflected some nuance itself in dealing with this problem. It's not all as extreme as I just described. Here at the Xiangshan Forum, where I am now in Beijing, there was a higher level of representation from the Department of Defense.
The Pentagon.
The Pentagon. There was a Deputy Assistant Secretary for China, which reflects the importance of the U.S.-China relationship to the Pentagon. And the gentleman who holds that position made a set of remarks, and they were extremely inclusive. They talked about the free and open Indo-Pacific policy as an overall effort to try to bring in the countries in the region, Indo-Pacific, including China, and was not designed to try to keep China out or to contain or undermine China. But this approach really contrasts very significantly, in my view, to some of the statements that have been made by other senior officials, more senior officials like Vice President Pence at the Hudson Institute, and even former Secretary of State Tillerson in talking about the free and open Indo-Pacific, where it seemed much more that these initiatives were designed to try to push back against and contain, curtail Chinese power and influence.
What would be, in your estimation, the most reasonable coexistence between the two biggest economies, if not the two biggest militaries?
Well, I think we're headed towards a situation, as many people say, and this is not just the administration, the U.S. government, a relationship with China that's going to be more competitive.
More competitive.
But not adversarial. And that's where I fault the administration, because they too often blur that difference. They make it seem like competition is really zero-sum, that China is an adversary and China's presence should be undermined. That is not, in my view, a...
Perhaps American multinationals won't agree with your president. Wall Street won't agree.
Right. I mean, I think that is, we're seeing that. I mean, there's an effort to do what's called decoupling. I think Peter Navarro supports that idea of decoupling the U.S. and Chinese economies, which I think would be very destructive to both the U.S., China, and the global economy.
And perhaps a fictional as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, well, there are certain efforts that are underway that actually are resulting in some level of decoupling, but I think there has to be a floor under the relationship. There has to be a basic set of principles that the two sides can agree upon. There has to be a very frank discussion with action, not just words. I mean, we hear very good words from the Chinese leadership about wanting a harmonious world and win-win outcomes, but in fact, in real life, countries have serious differences, and power relationships do not go away. And so we have to be able to manage and deal with those power relationships in a more effective way, recognizing that there are different dimensions to our relationship. It's the most complex, the most challenging relationship I think the United States has ever had with another country.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.